Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on what time of day you're watching this. This is for year 12 or year 11, just looking at abortion. Now, you've got to be very careful if you're asked a question on abortion, because it all depends on when you think life begins. But even before we do that, look at the definition. Definition of abortion is the deliberate termination of a pregnancy, so the ending of a life or the ending of the life of a fetus within the womb. Now, most Christians would think this. They would see conception, that's when the sperm hits the egg, not contraception. Contraception is when you use family planning, condoms, pills, stuff like that. But conception is when the sperm enters the egg. Many Christians will say that is the moment when life begins, when life starts, because all the DNA of a new life is there in that tiny, tiny cell. And from that, the embryo will develop eventually into the fetus, and then the fetus will eventually develop into a child, and then a child into a baby, then into a child, then into a teenager, and then into an adult, and then into old age. Okay? Many Catholics will argue that there is no break, there's no break in that line. And so what you have right at the beginning here is a new life, is a human life. You can't say, well, human life started from here, because what was there before? A dog? I don't think so. It's the same life. There's a continuous life. And just as you wouldn't end the life of maybe a child over here saying, well, it's not yet a teen, many Christians would say, well, you wouldn't end a life over here just because it's a fetus, because eventually it'll become a baby and a child. They would also use biblical quotes. They would use the book of Job, spelled J-O-B, Job, but it's pronounced Job, to say that God has formed us. God has formed us in the womb. They'd look at the book of Jeremiah as well, where it talks about God having knew us even before we were born. So in other words, life is there from the beginning. If you take that approach, abortion is never, never, never right. The Catholic Church would take this line, because there is life right from the very beginning. Other Christians would say actually life does not begin at conception. They just see it as a tiny cell, and then division of cells, and then they'd look at the embryo and say, well, that's not really a life. And they'd say maybe when the heart begins to beat, that's when life starts, and therefore they would respect life from that moment on. But before then, they would say, well, you could do what you like, you could experiment on it, because life hasn't started. So that's not a problem. Life is not there, you could have the abortion. But from any moment when you think life begins within the pregnancy, then abortion would be wrong after that point, but fine before that, because you say, well, actually, there isn't a life there. We would not be breaking the 10 Commandments, do not kill. Whereas a huge number of Catholics would say conception. That is when life begins. That's where we have the biblical evidence. That's where we have scientific evidence, DNA, telling us everything that is within us, everything that's within me now started at the moment of my conception, and there's no natural break in that development, and therefore it would be wrong to end life. They'd also say, well, God gave life, only God can take life. God made each of us in his image. At what point does his image come into us? Probably right at the very beginning when we started. So make it very, very clear to the examiner, if you're answering a question, if you believe life begins at conception, then abortion is always wrong. If you believe life begins later on in the pregnancy, then those Christians would say, well, it's fine to have an abortion before that point.